Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researcher Celebrity. Today we have emeritus, like in all the terms of when we say celebrity, we normally say researcher celebrity, let's celebrate research. But we have the fortune of having Professor Robert Coulson with us today, who in all terms are our celebrity. A brief about him is he has done his bachelor's from Furman University, and then for master's and PhD he attended University of Georgia, did a small postdoc, a short postdoc probably, at Institute of Ecology, and since 1970, 1st June 1970, he's at Texas A&M. With this small introduction, I would like to welcome Professor Coulson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we always start our conversations that how and when you decided that you want to be a researcher.
Well, there was serendipity involved in it. I was, as an undergraduate student, was studying biology and didn't really know where that was going to lead. A bachelor's degree in biology doesn't have a lot of future to it as a scientist. But I had the good fortune of stopping by a laboratory. Bartlett Tree Expert Company in Stamford, Connecticut had a laboratory. And one Christmas vacation, I drove up to the lab and knocked on the door and said, "Do you hire summer technicians?" And they said, "Yeah." And it turned out that they had, the laboratory did basically extension kinds of work for the company. The Bartlett Tree Expert Company is nationwide now. And they had a plant pathologist, a entomologist, and a plant physiologist. And they basically did extension kinds of work for the company, but they also had a research program. And so I found out that you could study insects, you could become an entomologist, and around our department, an entomologist is defined as a biologist with a job. And so there were lots of jobs in entomology, and I found out you could study insects and that there was a career waiting for you. And I've always been fascinated with insects. I never did really know how to organize. There were so many different insects, they did so many different things, and I didn't know how to classify it. And so that summer experience working as a laboratory technician basically opened the door to a career in entomology. And so when I went back and finished up my undergraduate degree, I went from there down to the University of Georgia. And I hit University of Georgia at a miraculous time. Some of the most renowned ecologists in the world were there. Eugene P. Odom, for example, and others. A fellow named D.A. Crosley Jr., who was an ecosystem ecologist, and Bernie Patton, who basically defined what systems ecology was about. So it was a provocative place to be. A really interesting group of graduate students that became lifelong friends. So it was a marvelous experience to learn about entomology and I studied forest entomology. I was always interested in what insects did in natural environments. And so when I finished graduate school, I did a postdoc at Coweta Hydrologic Laboratory out in western North Carolina, looking at canopy arthropods, canopy insects, and looking at the diversity of insects that occurred in the canopies of trees. And from there, was offered a position with Texas A&M University as a forest entomologist. And the first couple of years, I had a joint appointment with the Texas Forest Service and the Department of Entomology. And then I was stationed in Lufkin, Texas, which is in the forest in East Texas. And from there, moved over to campus in 1973 and have been there ever since. So
let's talk about this. When you mentioned about your summer trip to this entomology and knocking the door, when students normally takes time off, enjoy, what made you travel to that laboratory?
Well, I've always had a job, you know, and when I came home for the summers, well, even before that in high school, I always have had some kind of a job. And I was looking, I had been, my folks lived in Stamford, Connecticut, which is right outside of New York City. My dad worked in New York City. And in the previous summers, I worked as an assistant in tennis at a yacht club.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it was fun, but it wasn't leading to anything except just a good time. And so that I wanted to change that, and I said, well, maybe this laboratory had Summers, needed technician help.
Mhm.
I didn't really know what to expect. I anticipated it would probably be laboratory kinds of work.
Mhm.
There was a little bit of that involved in it, but it was mostly entomology and two different projects that I worked on there.
Mhm.
And one of them, there was a student from the University of Massachusetts that was working on a master's degree,
Mhm.
and I basically worked as his technician, basically counted insect samples and that sort of thing. And the other project actually involved a very famous park in Philadelphia called Fairmount Park,
Mhm.
and they had an outbreak of an insect there that they were going to, back in those days, they sprayed insecticides,
Mhm.
broadcast insecticides, and so they did a treatment down there at Fairmount Park, and we did a before and after sampling and to see what the efficacy of the treatment was, and so I counted insects for
Mhm.
part of the summer. So it was a marvelous experience with outstanding people. The pathologist, for example, had a PhD degree from Harvard. The insect physiologist, or the physiologist, had a degree from Duke, and one of the entomologists had a degree from Syracuse, and the other one had one from UMass.
Mhm.
And so these were really talented, outstanding people, and they were great mentors. They were people that were patient with me, and I guess maybe because I was enthusiastic about learning about insects, they mentored me in that regard too. So it was just a marvelous experience, and I've remained friends with them throughout most of their careers. They retired, many years ago now, but they were good friends and good mentors at the very beginning of my career. So it was a marvelous serendipitous experience. It wasn't I had no concept that it would lead to that going on and knocking on a door at Christmas time would lead to a lifelong career, but it did.
Absolutely, and this is something which we always try to convey here at Researcher Celebrity, that curiosity is what makes you researcher.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If entomology allows for you to seek curiosity in many, many ways, more so than any other taxon. You can, when I wrote a book defined what, when I was teaching a course called Insect Ecology, one of the questions that I had at the beginning is what is insect ecology? And if you look around the country, that course is taught in every entomology department, and it's a different course in every one. So I wrote an article on what is insect ecology. And one of the things one of the points of emphasis of that study of what insect ecology was the fact that insects do lots of things that are important to us. They pollinate our flowers, they transmit diseases, they eat our food, they kill our trees. So there are lots of things about studying entomology, lots of ways to study entomology. I guess the most gratifying part of it for me has been most of the research that we have done in the past has been on insects that are considered to be pests. There's always been lots of research money available to study pest insects. In recent years, I've been able to study honeybees, mostly feral honeybees, but honeybees in the city of Tucson, for example. And the most rewarding research that I've ever been involved in has dealt with monarch butterflies. And so we've, over the last 7 or 8 years, worked on different aspects of honeybee or monarch butterfly migration.
So in the year, like more than 6 decades of research career,
Yeah.
including the doctorate and thing, the challenges and the accomplishments of a researcher.
Well, in a tier 1 university like Texas A&M University, you have to have the formula for success is you have to have a funded research program. In other words, you have to have money to be able to do research. You have a teaching responsibility, and you have a service responsibility. And if you have a research program, the currency for evaluating the research program is the number of publications that you have. So that you have to have research money and you have to publish papers. And that is really where the game begins. And as long as you do that, you can be employed by a great university like Texas A&M for a long time.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, it's been that model has been in place forever. And it turns out the world's full of money. The traditional sources of money to do forest entomology research, a lot of that came out of the Forest Service. But there's NEFA money for forest entomology kinds of problems too. But the other thing is that as a university professor, you have a fairly large or fairly serious latitude in what you can do, as long as you can find funds to do it. So in recent years, I've had a project on chimpanzees in Guinea.
Wow.
Yeah, we published a paper in primatology on that one. Another one that we just submitted a paper, a publication on, deals with the niche modeling of red-crowned parrots. Red-crowned parrots are native to the southern part of Texas and into Mexico, and they're an endangered species. And so it's ranged from bark beetles to hemlock woolly adelgids to seed and cone insects to chimpanzees to birds. So there's a lot of ways to satisfy your curiosity. And as a biologist, I'm an ecologist first, and most of the work that we've done in recent years has been in landscape ecology, spatial ecology. And that is an area now that has really blossomed. There are lots of landscape ecologists, but when we got into the business in around 1984, 85, it was really in the United States was a new discipline, and there really weren't a lot of principles and concepts that had been developed at that time. So we've been involved in the journey of the development of landscape ecology since the mid-'80s. And part of the reason that we got into it is we were working for organizations like U.S. Forest Service, and a lot of the work that we had conducted with research that we conducted with them was at the population level. We were looking at bark beetles attacking and killing trees and infestations growing, and finally the questions that was important work, and we published a ton of papers on that kind of research. But the questions that the agencies were asking were, well, okay, what is the effect of bark beetles in a national forest? Okay, so they were spatial questions, and they were that we didn't have answers to. We didn't even have, that was before geographic information systems became established technologies. So the questions that we were getting were landscape scale questions that we didn't really know how to do. So we learned spatial statistics, we learned GIS, and we grew with that. And now the remote sensing technologies and UAVs and all our unmanned aerial systems, UAS, are commonplace and common tools that are used. It's like in your field where you have to have, if you want to be successful as a scientist, you have to have a toolbox. And that toolbox changes throughout a career. So the toolbox that I had when I got out of graduate school is totally irrelevant in today's world. So as a scientist, you're going to have to evolve with the tools and technologies. And now is a marvelous time to be a scientist because the technology and the tools that are available to you are astounding. We can do things that 10 years ago you couldn't have even dreamed of doing. So.
Absolutely. And this brings us to one of the most important question here, because here when the researchers today are watching this video, they don't even know, at least half of them don't use the journals anymore, the printed journals, going and checking for the papers of their interest, and sometimes the paper is not there. You have to write to the author if they can send you a copy. Doing research back in like 5 decades ago, is obviously way different from this.
Oh yeah.
The challenges, the perks, everything. What was the most challenging part of doing research 50 years ago, and what is the most accomplishing part at that time?
Well, what's changed is access to information. Well, that's one of the things that's changed, aside from the technological developments. I published a book in landscape ecology called Basic Landscape Ecology, and in that book, at the front end of it, there is a timeline that I established, like when was the first book in GIS published? When was Google? When was the first PC? And so you can look at the dates on that thing, and it starts about 1984, 85 is when the real technological developments began to show. GPS, for example, the first GPS unit that I saw, we were at a conference in Denver, Colorado, a GIS conference there, and one of the postdocs that was working with me came over and said, "Bob, you've got to take a look at this. They've got something called a GPS over here." And so we went over and looked at it, and Trimble was the company that manufactured it. Turned out the postdoc knew more about how to use it than the guy trying to sell it before it was all over with. And so we went out to the streets of Denver and got our location and came back in. At that time, you had to, the government was scrambling the coordinates, and so you had a correction that you had to make, and you could identify where you were. Well, that technology changed a lot of what you could do in spatial ecology. It was a marvelous tool that was never available. So I would say that the access to information quickly has completely changed the game. I'm doing a second edition of this Basic Landscape Ecology book right now, and the field has changed drastically since the first publication. That book was published in like 2011 or 12. And so the new story is quite different than the old one, and it's extremely easy to update your knowledge of that area. You can do literature searches and you can get access to the PDFs of the papers. One of them, for example, there was that I'm using right now, or part of what a chapter that I'm working on involves something called ecosystem assembly. How do ecosystems assemble, or how are they assembled? And there was a fella in Australia who wrote a paper on ecosystem assembly, and I found it. It was the citation was in Press, and so I sent the guy an email and said, "Look, I'm trying to write about this subject. Would you mind sharing it with me?" And he did. He sent me a copy of the paper before it was published. So it's this worldwide communication with other people, easy access to the literature, and even for example, if you wanted to talk with somebody about if you're confused about the meaning of something, you can Zoom.
Yes.
So it is a times of miracle and wonder, as Paul Simon would say.
So now most of your work deals with the field research, and in present ages, students are more focused. Most of them, they want to be in the AC, get a luxury, stable life. How difficult or how easy it is for you to find a student who's very much interested in the field work and they are all committed towards it?
Well, you have to do that up front. If almost all the projects that we work on are funded or by some sort of organization, some agency, and if it involves field research, that's how the job is advertised. And so, if the employee, the student, doesn't want to work outdoors, I always thought that was the most marvelous part of what I could do. I can't do it anymore. My life is so encumbered with that taking time to go into the field and do field research is almost impossible for us to do on a sustained basis. When I first came back out to Texas out of graduate school, the summers we spent in the field working on bark beetles. But and some students just don't want to do that kind of work. I always thought it was one of the glorious things about being an entomologist is you could work outdoors.
True. So this brings us to the next question about when you have a wide variety of students. Some of them are very much interested in something, some of them have a different, goals or objectives. How do you ensure the success of your students?
Well, a lot of that, you have to develop a rapport with them to find out what they do well and what they don't do well. I think maybe it's the fundamental issue with dealing with people is honesty. If you're honest with students, sometimes you have to criticize them. Sometimes they can criticize you back. The atmosphere that I try to create in my laboratory is one of camaraderie. Is that we're colleagues in that lab. There's somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be the authority there. But in doing the research, we're colleagues. I'm trying to create an environment where people can be creative, be collegial with one another. That's always been part of the lab. The collegiality of the lab was always took care of itself. Well, it was not anything that I had to try to create. It just took care of itself. So it's always been a friendly environment, a friendly atmosphere, but it also is a mission-oriented one. It's one where everybody has to perform. Everybody's got a different working style and hours that they prefer to work. And so I'm really very tolerant of different work styles. The work ethic part of it is I'm not real tolerant with people that are not doing their job, but I don't ever have to deal with that. The people that come to work with me know who I am and know what the expectations are of they're successful, I'm successful, and they know that. And they're there for a purpose. They're working on degrees. They want to be professionals in the business of entomology or ecology. So there's a mission for them as well as one for me in our association.
So you worked with starting from beetles till chimpanzee.
Yeah.
So how do you see, because entomologists normally don't go till chimpanzees until unless it is about their pest or insect which is feeding on them or vector or something. How did this wane? And then again the second point in addition to this is like the landscape, the ecology. And here I would like to tell all the audience here that Professor Coulson is a co-founder for Knowledge Engineering Laboratory way back in 1984 at Texas A&M, which itself was very innovative, and I can say that it was ahead of its time.
Yeah,
now people know what use of it is, and you in a way that you created a field which was not there before you.
Yeah, to some degree that's true. Again, it goes back to the questions that the very first big research program that I was involved in was called, it dealt with bark beetles, and there were 3 units to it. There was a western pine beetle, mountain pine beetle, and southern pine beetle, and it was hugely funded. Over a 10-year period, about $20 million were spent on, or was spent on research on that insect. At the end, and that was when that program started, it was at the front end of the concept of modeling. No one knew what a model was, and so we had colleagues over in engineering. It was a biosystems research group, and they were engineers, a physiologist, a physicist, operations research engineer, and so we partnered with them to develop models, and other people around the South did too. Well, at the end of the 10-year period, the forest managers that this research was really conducted to help were still making decisions the same way they did in the past. Mm-hmm. So none of these models, excuse me, none of the models that were developed were being used. And so what we found out was, and no manager is going to sit down and run a simulation model.
Yeah.
What they wanted was what the model predicted. For example, if our model of bark beetles would project the number of trees that were going to be killed over a period of time, And so if it was 50 trees that were going to be killed in 3 months, or 5,000 trees, if it was 5,000 trees, that's what the manager wanted to know. So managers made decisions that involved tabular information, information that was associated with simulation models, heuristic knowledge, just the knowledge that experts have because they work in the field. Time on the tool is what the craftsman will tell you. So it involved these systems that we developed at that time. They were mostly expert systems. Involved the integration of those different kinds of knowledge, and that was new. And the technology to do it wasn't there. You know, we had good support from the computer science department, and we developed decision support systems before it was easy to do. Now Esri's got all kinds of software to enhance the building of those kinds of systems, and they're very common now. I mean, in the really sophisticated accounting programs, for example, have artificial intelligence built all the way through them. So it was a technology that it was fun. We had a really good time. But again, I guess if there's a take-home message there, it's from my perspective is that you basically had to reinvent yourself. We didn't know anything about how to do that, and when the Forest Service came to me and said, "Is there a way that we can integrate these models and other representations of knowledge?" I said, "Of course there is," and I didn't have any idea. I read in an in-flight magazine someplace, I read about expert systems, and so I went over to our colleagues in computer science and says, "Anybody know anything about this?" And it turns out that, you know, one of the marvelous things about Texas A&M University is it is a technical university. If you have a technical question, there's somebody on this campus that can answer it for you, and they'll work collaboratively with you. And so that's basically where the knowledge engineering laboratory came. And so that was the sort of the second reinvention of my research career. And then the third one was the landscape ecology issue. And that opens up lots and lots of opportunity. For example, in the case of the chimpanzees, the red-crowned parrots, and monarch butterflies, the commonality there was niche modeling. And niche modeling is a common activity amongst ecologists where you define what the niche dimensions are for these different animals. So we developed niche models for monarch butterflies, for chimpanzees. In the case of the chimpanzee story, that was really an interesting one. One of the postdocs that had worked for me, who was actually a geographer, went to work for an engineering consulting company, and when he was a student here, he had a daughter that was about 5 years old, and named Megan. And Jeff Fitzgerald is this fellow's name, and Jeff called me and he said, Megan, who's now a grown woman, is going to Guinea to study chimpanzees, and she wants to do a master's degree when she gets back. And so I said, well, okay. And he said, can you give her some guidance in terms of what might be an appropriate problem? And I said, well, I sent her a copy of the landscape ecology book and said, take a look at the section that deals with something called functional heterogeneity. And that is basically what an organism does and where it does it. All chimpanzees eat, drink, sleep, mate, and play. That's it. So record where they do that with a GPS, and when you come back, we'll develop a niche model on chimpanzees. And she did. And went through a program. I have a joint appointment in ecology and conservation biology. So she came through that program. When she finished it up, the work that she did was so remarkable that one of the directors of the largest primatology lab in the world, in University of Kyoto, used it to justify, further conservation activities in Guinea, and that bought Megan a PhD degree at the University of Kyoto, a full ride where it cost her nothing to go to school, and so she ended up getting a PhD degree in primatology. I tried to talk her out of the primatology part of it because it's such a narrow field, and she wouldn't have any part of it. So she's still working in that field now.
So this brings us to a very important question, that when a mentor want a student to follow certain path, and student has a different way to go.
Well, you can give advice, and it turns out that my advice might not have been very good. She wanted to work, in this particular case, she wanted to work on developing conservation concepts and plans, and do the administrative stuff with regard to primates, not just chimpanzees, but all the great apes. And she was passionate about wanting to do that as well as do research and that sort of thing. So I don't tell people to do things very often. You can look at opportunities. I think being flexible in terms of what you can work on and will work on is important. The idea, for example, of working on parrots or birds or chimpanzees or insects, as an ecologist, I don't have any problem. The tools work with the same. The technology that we modeled milkweed for monarch butterflies is the same technology that we used for an insect called a hemlock woolly adelgid that is a pest insect of hemlocks in the eastern United States and into Canada. And it's the same technology for the chimpanzees, the same technology for the parrots. The data is just different, and the ecological principles are essentially the same. In the case of the red-crowned parrot, one of the interesting things about that work was that mostly anthropogenic development reduces habitat for endangered species, and that's almost universal all over the planet. In the case of the red-crowned parrot down in South Texas, one of the conservation activities that goes on there is that the cities plant palm trees along roadways, and red-crowned parrots nest in cavities created in palm trees. And so the anthropogenic activity there is actually increasing habitat for the bird rather than decreasing it. So it's the only example that I know where that I can think of right offhand where anthropogenic activities actually lead to enhancing the conservation value or is a conservation value to the bird.
Yeah, so here I would like to tell all the audience here that you might have read Forest Entomology and Basic Land Ecology. These textbooks are co-authored by Professor Coulson, and this probably is your time also when you are feeling that your celebrity is in front of you, because these are the books you have read through your life and you decided you want to pursue. Some of part of it you have taken for your career path, and here you are listening directly from him. So here what I can understand about this conversation is like the importance of ecology was always there. Sometimes it was acknowledged. Now people do acknowledge it even more. Now you do anything and ecologists are there like, you cannot do this, you can do this, you should do this. Back when you were doing research in those days, how different was that? And when you see all the research inputs which you have given to the world and they are getting utilized for betterment of it, but if there is anything which you feel that people are not taking it the way you wanted them to.
No, the problem with science moves along incrementally, and over the course of a career, if you've stayed with a lot of entomologists will work with one taxon all the way through their career. Many of my early colleagues in this field were interested in bark beetles, and they're fascinating animals. There are lots of different ways that you can study bark beetles, and the research accumulates. And in the case of the bark beetle, we had two major symposia where scientists in different areas were asked to write chapters for a book. And the first one was called The Southern Pine Beetle. And They 10 years later, we did another one called Southern Pine Beetle 2. And so these are anthologies that basically bring together the technology or the state of knowledge about that insect, an interpreted view of it. And so I think that's, I think that's how you summarize what you've done over the course of a period of time, and because you typically publish multiple papers in it. I guess if I wanted to emphasize one satisfying research experience, the monarch butterfly story is an interesting one. In the state of Texas, the Comptroller General's office, which is a bank, controls the resources, the money to do research on endangered species. And so they put an RFP out for a request for proposals for basic research on monarch butterflies. And that was a 3 or 4 year program. And we defined what the migration corridor boundaries were, and we also identified that roadkill was a significant issue in terms of the fall migration back to the overwintering sites in Mexico. Well, from there we went to and proposed to the Texas Department of Transportation has a research program. And so we proposed a research project for them to look into how significant that roadkill was. And so they funded it, and that was another 3 year program. And we just started a program this year. They came back to us, and the Texas Department of Transportation said, well, can we mitigate the mortality? Is there something from our research that we can implement to protect the insects? And the answer is, well, yeah, there is. And what we're doing now is developing what are flight deflectors, so that they're basically porous walls that you can put up along the side of the road to deflect the movement of the insect over. We found out there were hot spots where the mortality was really significant. Causeways, for example, was one of the places where that happened, and an area out in West Texas along the Interstate 10, which is a major highway system through there. So we're implementing those flight deflectors. So it's a quintessential example of what a land-grant university should be about, or is about. Is you do basic research that has meaning to the citizens of the state of Texas, in our case, and you take that information and you implement it, and so it shows how you can go from basic research to an implemented strategy to reduce the mortality caused by vehicle collisions with insects. So that part of it was really a very gratifying experience, to go from the basic research to an implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you develop something like this, it is the path which now the coming generation will follow, because you have shown that starting from the concept to the implementation, things might not go only in one direction, but you can implement the same concept in different directions.
Well, typically you don't get to do all of it. Typically the research that you do, if it has implementable attributes to it, somebody else usually does that. I'll give you an example right now. Is that we have we're looking at pollinators associated with forests in East Texas. It turns out, it turns out also that bumblebees are a significant issue with regard to endangered species protection. And so we're looking at niche modeling again, these bumblebee species, and where we can identify where they're located, and then we can look at the land use, land cover in the area that we identify as the habitat for them, and we can see what conservation plans can be implemented to protect the habitat once we know where it is and then how the land is being used, and you can manipulate that. Well, that we won't be involved. The Texas Forest Service and the AgriLife Extension would be the people that actually implemented the changes in it. But we did the basic research that provided the information that they needed to make the decision or make the conservation plans for them. So it's unusual to be involved all the way through in it.
Okay. Yeah. So here we did speak about research and challenges, accomplishments. Now, speaking of researcher, as a human being, now talk about family and friends with this long journey, how a researcher as a human being enjoyed this course.
Well, I think you have to understand when if you become at least a university professor doing research, you have to understand that there is no beginning and no end. It's a continuous. The bank doesn't close at 5 o'clock. I mean, you always are have something more to do that needs to be done. I married a marvelous person who basically knew that story before we got married. So certain times, for example, you're going to have to go 5, 6, 7 days in a row where you're continuously involved in doing something, and then you can stop and go play around the golf. But it's a continuous job. And most of everybody that I know and my colleagues in the entomology department all recognize that it doesn't end at the end of the day. That it's a continuous process, and you have to want to do that. I think the curiosity part of it is what keeps you coming back to it. Is that when I get up in the morning, it's still fun to come into work, and right now writing this book and trying to, the landscape ecology book is a real challenge. But every day when I get up, I come in with that attitude, well, I'm going to get to use my head to do something creative. And I think maybe that's part of what keeps, part of being a scientist is you have to like and want to be creative, and you want to use your intellect to in more than just a entertaining way, where you're actually contributing something that's significant to other people.
Absolutely, and this is something which I would like to emphasize on to all of our viewers here, that it doesn't matter that how much work you have done, how many years you have been through that process. The curiosity, the enthusiasm which you can see in Professor Coulson right now is, I'm sure, that not reduced when he was a teenager and now. You can see that enthusiasm, that how energetic he feels every day morning to come and do the things which he really wants to. And one of our researcher celebrity, Professor Ethan Beer at UCSD, he mentioned that if research gives you stress, it is not for you. And I see this in general application, that anything which gives a stress to you, there are always bumpy rides, roller coasters, where there are roadblocks which you eventually overcome. But if something is giving you stress and it is prolonging, probably that is the time when you check that what you want to do or not. Coming back to Professor Coulson, that you are a golfer. Okay.
Yeah, well,
you publish papers. Which one is more satisfying when you are playing an hour of golf, or getting a title there, or getting published?
No, I compartmentalize things like that. The playing golf is a journey, and it's one that golf is a game that you never master. It always is fun. So it's a challenge, and it's physical, and I like to get out and be outdoors. That's really the only activity now that I have where I'm outdoors a lot. But it's entirely different than the joy that you get out of doing research. They're just two different compartments, and.
But it is a win-win situation. You enjoy both the places.
Oh yeah, but if I had to give up one, I'd give up golf.
Okay.
And because I really the idea of being able to use your intellect to create new knowledge and to solve problems and all, it's always been something that was challenging and interesting to me and easy to do. I guess that's the thing, that if you find things to do that you like to do, that you find easy. There's the thing about the research business, that where the stress comes into it, is that you have to have research dollars to be able to do it, and that is an endless war. That you have to be vigilant. You have to keep your eyes open about what is fundable research, where is the money, and who's got it, and what are the questions that are being asked and answered that agencies are willing to pay money to find out. So that part of it has always been stressful. And science moves forward incrementally, and it's a criticism-based world. So when you write a paper and you send it off to a journal, sometimes you get beat up. I mean, sometimes it's a humbling experience. So if you're going to get into the science business, you better be able to take criticism, because it's a criticism-based business. So there is stress associated with finding resources of money, and it has to be continuous. You can't you can't go for long periods of time without any money. I've had a continuously funded research program for 53 years. There's never been a break in that where we haven't had money. Well, that doesn't happen by chance. You have to get out and hustle to make sure that happens. So
that is marvelous. And here I want to ask one more question. When it comes to selection between personal and professional choices, most often researchers go for professional ones.
Yeah.
Then what are your thoughts about work and life balance then?
Well, again, that's a lot of that depends on your specific circumstance. If, for example, we live I live a very privileged life, and I live in a free country. I have a nice job that pays money. I have a family that is tolerant of the amount of time it takes to do this. So that is, I think, unusual. Okay, that you can have a career in that is luxurious, I guess, for lack of a better word. I mean, this is not a stressful world to live in. It's a glorious world, and so I don't separate out. I can't judge how difficult it would be, for example, to be a researcher if you were in Croatia now, okay, or other parts of the world. I did consulting work in Kenya, in Nairobi, and two different kinds of laboratories there. One of them was a CG center, which at that time it was called ILRAD, International Laboratory for Research on Animal Diseases. And that was a really well equipped. There was no laboratory here in the U.S. that was any better equipped than that. But across town there was that was a CG center. The other research that was being done there in Nairobi was not like that at all. The researchers didn't have the resources, they didn't have the equipment. They had the passion to do the work, but it was much more difficult to do, and they weren't paid very much. So it was a different world, certainly than what that I experienced. Texas A&M University has always been a marvelous place to work. I mean, it's as I said, a Tier 1 university that it's huge. I mean, we have, 80,000 students here and huge faculty, and so it's a marvelous place to work. So I really have been privileged to have been able to live in that world for a whole career.
Absolutely. And here, when now recently the research is moving into something called as interdisciplinary research, but you actually enjoyed it even before, when people know that what interdisciplinary research is. And
well, what you find out is that even if you have a robust toolbox yourself, they're specialists in all fields. And at Texas A&M University, well, I'll give you an example. We had one of the questions that we were interested in looking at with bark beetles was, how do they disperse? In order for a an organism to persist, it has to get away from its natal home eventually, but you'll eat up all the resources. And so long distance dispersal with bark beetles was something that we didn't understand how it worked. No one did, or does for that matter. But anyway, what we thought we might be able to do was to simulate, well, one of the observations that had been made is that there was dispersal right at the time frontal thunderstorms moved through. You may recall that typically when one of those thunderstorms comes up, the temperature drops and the wind velocity increases. And so what we hypothesized is that the insects were catching those wind currents, and that would move them a long distance. And as long as the velocity of the wind was at a certain level, it would entrain the insect, and when the velocity decreased, it would drop out. Well, how could you measure that? Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out we have a wind tunnel here at Texas A&M, and so postdoc and I went out there, knocked on the door, and talked to the director of it, who was an aerospace engineer, and he says, "Yeah, we can do," but he said, "We have another wind tunnel down in the catacombs of this place," and so we went down there and looked at that one, and you could simulate turbulence in the smaller wind tunnel, mm-hmm. which was important part of the story. And I said, "Well, how are we gonna scale these? These bark beetles don't weigh very much. We're gonna build a model of a forest, mm-hmm. and we're gonna create the current, and we want to test to see how they'll move." Mm-hmm. Well, bubbles. You use bubbles to simulate basically calibrate the difference in weight. So, but again, you can do that at Texas A&M University. And so the aerospace engineer said, "Yeah, this is a really cool story," and so he was willing to work with us. We never got the project funded, but we got close.
Sometimes it's about the fun, which is more satisfying.
Well, we figured out how to do it, and but I couldn't have done that myself. You needed an engineer to help you with the simulation itself. We could interpret it, and we knew what the question was, but we didn't know how to do it, how to solve it. And this guy could help us with the part that we couldn't do. And it's true with, when we got into the artificial intelligence, the expert system business, we didn't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that there was only one computer at the time that could process this object-oriented code, and it was called a symbolics computer. And so we bought symbolics computers, and we learned Lisp, mm-hmm. and learned how to do it. So. But our engineering friends are the ones that showed us how to do all that. I mean, so we didn't know how to do it.
Nice. So now when we are walking towards the edge of the conversation, I would like to ask you the recommendations or suggestions to young researchers who are either just into the research already, doing their PhD or early postdocs, or there are people, the young brains, who are thinking to consider research as their career path for the rest of their life. What are the things they should be more vigilant to?
Well, you have to want to do it. Again, we've said this several times during this conversation, is that it starts with being curious about whatever. And if you have a curious mind, then I would say that the experience that I had with working with people who, at the very beginning of my career when I was working as a lab technician, that showed me that you could that you could do research, and that was something that I said I want to do that. Mm-hmm. That's something that it appeals to me. If it's work, or if you're not curious about what you're doing and you're not passionate about it, then go do something else. Mm-hmm. So those are personal decisions that you have to make, and how you do it. The kind of research that you do is entirely different than what we do. Mm-hmm. Our work has always, ecological work has always been based on how do ecological systems work. Mm-hmm. And you do experiments where so it's an entirely different approach to doing. if somebody said, Bob, you want to be a molecular biologist, and the answer is no, I don't want anything to do with the kind of research that you guys find really fascinating.
Yes.
And the toolbox is entirely different, and the discoveries are different, and so I think that's a personal decision you have to make. If you enjoy doing it, you're likely to be good at it. The thing that you have to develop a toolbox, and a lot of the students that come through the entomology department initially don't want to do that. To learn the spatial ecology stuff, for example, we have a certificate program in GIS. It's a 5 or 6 course certificate. And so I recommend that the students go through that. And if you don't like to sit in front of a computer and do spatial statistics and that sort of stuff, do something else, because that's where you're going to be.
Absolutely. So we will say thank you very much, Professor, taking
My
time
pleasure.
out, sharing this journey with us, and giving all the important points here. I would like to tell all the audience, if you want to write directly to Professor Bob, you have seen the enthusiasm he carries. I'm sure you can borrow some from him, because he has a lot of it. And to conclude our conversation today, the 2 points, if I can, with your permission, say that curiosity, that is the first thing which you should have if you are thinking to be a researcher. And the second point is, that is just what I learned today, is knocking on doors is very fruitful. So you go, knock on the doors. Professor Coulson knocked it multiple times, starting from the summer internship till today, when he goes out and talk to people, establish new collaborations, because that is what it takes to be in the field and to be excel. The most important part is you should love what you do. And with this, we'll say thank you, Professor Coulson.
My pleasure.
And for all the audience, stay tuned. Watch our Researcher Celebrity. If you want to put us in any touch of any of our Researcher Celebrity, please feel free. Write it to us and then we'll put you in there. Till then, enjoy your research and keep doing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.